Let's get to NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster. He is live now in Minneapolis. Shaq, what is the reaction there to Amy Klobuchar's announcement, both that the charges against Derek Chauvin will go from third-degree murder to second, and that we do expect the other 3 officers to be arrested and charged?
You heard applause, you heard cheers, you heard chants saying we got all 4. People were, they really appreciated the charges that just came in. And you said, and you mentioned Amy Klobuchar, and that we heard the announcement first from her on her Twitter feed, but I just got into my email. We're looking at the charges. Officer Chauvin, the officer who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd for about 9 minutes, his charges have been upgraded to 2nd-degree murder, and that's according to the Minnesota court system right now. So that is official on Officer Chauvin and the escalation of those charges. Initially, it was a 3rd-degree murder charge that he had initially. But let me just show you around a little bit. You see people from all walks of life. They were here commemorating, as we've been seeing all week long, people bringing flowers, people handing out water, people wearing masks and handing out masks to folks. You see that community feeling right now, and what you saw were people looked down at their phones and someone read out the charge out loud, saying that all 4 officers have been charged, which has been the main call of these protesters. It's been exactly what they've been calling for over a week now. And now that all officers have been charged, you heard that celebration. There was a very solemn moment as people started singing all in unison. It was a moment that really, you could tell people really came together, and there was an appreciation that they finally got what they were looking for, and that's for all 4 officers involved in the death of George Floyd, for them to be arrested and charged.
Shaq, do we have any sense of the timing here, when those officers might actually be arrested? Any updates on the timeline? I know this is all so fresh, and we're just getting this news trickling in right now.
No update on the timing of that yet. We will expect to hear from Keith Ellison, who's the Attorney General. He actually took control of the prosecution of this case. This is a case that initially was being prosecuted by the county prosecutor, but then the state came in, Keith Ellison came in. He said in the past week that he would expect to see these charges, these officers to be charged. And you're seeing, it seems like that's starting to happen, and those wheels are starting to turn. Allison?
Shaq, this has been quite a day in Minneapolis. You were there earlier today when the Floyd family showed up. They went to visit the site where George Floyd died. Yeah. Could you tell us about that incredibly emotional visit and what his family had to say?
Yeah, you saw, it's the scene right here that you saw the son of George Floyd come up. He walked over, he got on one knee, and then he had a prayer. It was a very solemn moment, a very sacred moment, and that's what you continue to see the family come here. And that's when you heard Benjamin Crump call for the arrest of the 4 officers, and that's what you keep seeing here at this site.
Shaq, have we gotten reaction from the family yet today to the news, the upgraded charges?
Yes, we did, and I'm going to pull it right on my phone. Benjamin Crump, the family attorney, actually responded, and he had a statement. He said, "We are deeply," he said, "This is bittersweet. This is a bittersweet moment. We are deeply gratified that Attorney General Ellison took decisive action, arresting and charging all the officers involved in George Floyd's death and upgrading the charge against Derek Chauvin to a felony 2nd-degree murder. Hashtag justice for George." Again, when Benjamin Crump, when he came here with the son of George Floyd, he said, and they were calling for these charges, he said that would come before the memorial service. We know there's a memorial service tomorrow here in Minneapolis, and then in North Carolina this weekend, another service before Mr. Floyd is laid to rest in Houston on Saturday. So this is exactly what they've been calling for, not only the attorney, not only the family, but leaders here in Minneapolis and across the state and across the country, frankly, calling for the arrest of all of the officers involved. Yeah. Allison?
Shaq, this has been quite a day already in Minneapolis. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.